Can't lip read.
Okay.
That's better.
That sounds better.
Right. Okay, good. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good.
And it's my duty to welcome the representatives of Telstra to provide evidence today. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Hugh Bradlow, and Chief Scientist at Telstra.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the House. I would invite you to make a brief opening statement, if you wish, before we proceed to discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to emphasise the position. I'm afraid we seem to have a lot of echo on this line. I don't know, perhaps.
You might be getting feedback. We're fine at our end, unless it's too annoying for you.
Yeah, it is pretty off-putting. Would it be possible to turn the volume down on your end a bit?
Now, what does that do?
It should reduce the echo.
No.
Is that better? They've turned it down.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's still echoing, but I'll persist. Don't worry. Hopefully it will not be too bad. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could make a quick statement, I would like to emphasize the point that we made in our paper about technology change. I think that there's recognition that the rate of technology change is accelerating significantly, and that the key requirement for all sectors of our economy in the next 10 to 20 years is going to be extremely fast adopters of that smart ICT technology. And that the industries that adopt it fast will be the winners in this new world, and those that don't will obviously fall behind very quickly, because with an accelerating rate of change, it's very easy to get off the pace and stay off the pace for a long time. And in our submission, we talked about the impact on the transport system and also on the health system, but I'd also like to emphasize that there are other sectors of the economy that are equally important, like energy generation and distributed energy grids, which are going to play a major role. So those are all areas that are going to be significantly impacted in the short term, and that's why we want to emphasize the importance of technology adoption.
Thank you. Shall we move straight to questions? And maybe I'll throw initially to you, Matt.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Thank you, Professor Bradlow. Autonomous vehicles, how soon do you think realistically they will be in Australia and being used on our roads, and what does government need to do to prepare for that change?
So they will certainly be on our roads at the beginning of the next decade. I think it's realistic to assume that by the end of the next decade, we could turn every car into an autonomous vehicle, because the technology to actually make cars autonomous is falling in price very rapidly. And you could also use aftermarket kits to turn existing cars into autonomous vehicles. The returns for the economy will be enormous. It'll save, in my estimate, about 1,000 lives a year. It will have a dramatic impact on reducing the requirement for road infrastructure. In terms of what government can and should do, there are basically two opportunities. The first is to put in place the regulations to allow them to be used. And the second is to move towards a situation, again through regulation, that would make all cars autonomous by a target date. because the maximum benefit will be accrued when the cars are all autonomous.
Thank you. I'll hand over to someone else here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hugh, with smart ICT, do you believe that government should actually mandate smart ICT for projects we fund? And second, Mr. Chairman, if I can extend that, how do we collect and store that securely? Have we got the capacity now, or should we look at government doing that?
So, yes, I do believe that governments should look to implement smart ICT in all their projects. And we should be looking at the regulations that enable it and also prevent it from disabled by entrenched interests. Do we have the capacity to store the data privately and securely? I believe we do. And I don't believe it needs to be done by government. Organizations such as Telstra are quite capable of doing that. But government could actually do it.
Thank you.
One of the things you touched on was the fact that the US is taking the lead in developing key standards in relation to establishing data standards. We've also heard throughout the inquiry about work that the UK government has done as well in this space. I wonder whether you'd care to elaborate on what the US has done and what their government has done.
So the US government has established the data.gov site in which they've put a lot of publicly available data in a consistent and available format with the appropriate interfaces to allow developers to access that data and incorporate it into their applications. The other thing that I think they've done that's significant is as part of Obamacare, they've mandated the use of electronic health records. And I'm starting to see the impact of that in terms of the health system. For example, there are companies that are making a system where when a patient phones a doctor, the phone system actually validates that that doctor is entitled to look at that patient's record and then will pop that up on the doctor's iPad. So in the conversation, the doctor has the information there and immediately available to him or her. So it's those types of interventions which start to make the system more efficient.
Have you got a question?
Yeah, just coming back to transport, and you know, you talk a lot in the submission about this. What are the implications of autonomous vehicles if they move at the pace you're saying, and I'm seeing lots of signs that they are, for rail transport and other forms of traditional public transport?
I don't believe it removes the need for mass transit. And in fact, if you look at the OECD model that they did of Lisbon, they showed that the maximum benefit is accrued by combining what they call taxi bots, which is effectively a self-driving car, which is also a shared vehicle and a taxi, and combining that with mass transit. And by doing that, they could actually reduce the rush hour congestion by 65% in Lisbon, according to the modeling. So I don't believe it obviates the need for mass transit, but I think what it does do is it complements it with a more convenient system for the ends of the mass transit system, and it obviates the need for individuals to own their own vehicles. And by individuals not owning vehicles, you not only get all the other benefits, but you also free up an enormous amount of parking space in urban environments.
Sure, but doesn't it become a sort of mass transit in its own right?
It is effectively a mass transit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, we have a division
Yeah, I'm sorry we have a division. We'll be back as soon as we can.
It's called massive.
Okay.
Mr. Bradlow, Bert Van Manen, the issue of technologies and actually the capability of the technology currently, I'd be interested to get some understanding from you as to the limitations that actually exist at present and how you see those limitations being overcome and how we also deal with the issue of obsolescence and ensuring that the data that we collect today can still be properly used in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, because these big infrastructure projects obviously have very long lifespans, and it's not a huge amount of value collecting an enormous amount of data now and then not being able to use it in 15 or 20 years' time. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
So, do you want to talk about a particular area of technology, or the whole sort of sweep of ICT?
Well, particularly in relation to smart ICT that we're using for mapping of buildings. So a lot of the discussion during the inquiry has been to do with BIM modelling and using that as I suppose, a foundation for collecting the spatial and other data necessary to manage our infrastructure and both roads and rail, but also buildings, and how we keep that that information relevant, that it can continue to be used into the future.
So I think that the answer to that lies in what are known as big data technologies, which is the ability to collect data in multiple formats and structures and then perform analyses using techniques such as search or machine learning or artificial intelligence. What that allows you to do is, first of all, because the rate of change of data grows, you can pretty well collect all data and just keep it. Now, you made the point about obsolescence. With time, electronic formats will change, but there's no reason why you can't migrate the data into new formats. And because these big data technologies do not rely on particular data structures, they can deal with unstructured data. It means that you don't have to have data in a particular format that means it cannot be used in the future. The technologies for analyzing data are becoming smarter and will be able to deal with the previous versions of the formats.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your submission. I just was hoping I could draw out a couple of aspects of it. In particular, when you talk about in 4.2 creating an appropriate regulatory environment, are you really just talking about removing regulatory impediments, or are you looking at a different architecture of regulation?
I think it's a combination of both. Clearly, there will be resistance to the introduction of some of these technologies. For example, in the power generation space, the combination of solar plus battery is going to become cheaper by the end of the decade to produce a unit of electricity than they're coming out of a coal-fired power station. But there are significant vested interests in current coal generation technology. And the regulation has to both address those vested interests and existing interests, as well as enable the new technologies to come on stream. So the regulation is an enabler and a disabler, depending on how it's done. The other thing that governments can do is, as I say, is encourage adoption. So governments can set lighthouse goals that would become national objectives. For example, have every car self-driving by the end of next decade is a sort of thing you could think of that would fall into that category.
Thank you, Professor Bradlow. And just one other matter I wouldn't mind drawing you out on, if I may. In 4.3, you talk about breaking the nexus between work and place, which is a really important conversation, particularly for those of us who represent outer suburban electorates. I guess I am concerned, though, that in promoting telecommuting as a goal of itself, that we don't walk away from some of the benefits of agglomeration. And I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts in that regard, or whether I'm perhaps reading the submission with a bit more of a gloss than I should.
No, I'm not saying you're reading it with more gloss. I think, though, that there's going to be, this is a human behavior issue, and there's some environments where you need to have people together, and there's some environments where you don't, some job types of role. The opportunity, of course, lies for those who are not mobile and cannot get into particular places. So for the technology enables the disabled, for a starter. As you can see, I'm actually living what I say. This is my office, and it's not perfect, as you can tell from some of the audio-visual problems we've encountered. But that technology is improving very rapidly, and a lot of those disconnections that occur from separate people will be overcome as the technology gets better definition, lower latency, the ability to spread multiple people across the wall. You can think of, you might have a room with multiple screens with different people spread on it so that I could see everyone in the committee at the same time. So those technology will improve dramatically over the next 10 to 15 years. And some of the industry impediments like standards and, land grabs by various companies will be overcome, and interwork will become much more possible. So I don't think it's an all or nothing situation. Nothing we've suggested in our paper is an all or nothing situation, but there's a steady movement of the needle from one side to the other.
Thank you very much, Professor Bradlow.
Professor Bradlow, could I just talk to you briefly about transition? Because often there's new technology, there's new ideas, but we don't know how to get from where we are to where we want to be. And it's often in that making that transition painless or strategically sensible. And a comment that you just made regarding the cost of electricity getting closer in regard to solar and battery storage to what's produced at a coal station. I often have reflected on that in this country. I have a different view of the tyranny of distance, but distance and our warm temperatures reduces that kilowatt of energy produced at a power station by sometimes around 50% by the time it gets to its destination. Distance and heat reducing that amount of energy. And I don't always think, or I haven't been convinced to this point, that the cost of that piece of energy, or that half amount of the energy produced at the coal station, is takes into account the cost of the poles and wires and the maintenance of those poles and wires. And so therefore, if we're to look at a transition, would it not be wise to give some consideration to regional and remote areas to transition earlier to such energy of solar and battery, knowing that the cost of getting the existing power source there is greater, and therefore there's an economic benefit immediately?
I think it definitely makes sense for regional and remote areas to be aggressive adopters of the technology, no question about it in my mind. The figures I've quoted you, I'm not completely sure whether they've taken the end-to-end cost of delivery, generation plus distribution into account or not. But there are significant advantages in terms of reliability if you've got solar plus battery, especially if you're in a regional area, because you're much less vulnerable to outages than you would be if you're totally reliant on grid energy. But there are also other opportunities, like as you point out, we live in a hot country. If you have enough solar power on your roof, you can run your air conditioner all day, leave your window open, and it costs you and the environment nothing to do so, because it's being generated by the solar panels. So those types of things will change the way we live, and therefore also, I think, combined with telecommunications, change the opportunities for regional and rural Australia.
And just pursuing this theme of transition in regard to autonomous vehicles, and following on what Angus discussed with you earlier, it would appear that as we move finally to all vehicles being autonomous, would it be a reasonable position to take during this transition that during peak hour traffic in urban areas that your vehicle must be autonomous, and therefore you're looking at a combination of public transport and this new form of, as Angus I think categorises, new form of public transport, combining to optimise the movement of people, and there could be other freedoms of autonomy or not during less precious times.
Yes, that's definitely a proposition, and there are a number of different ways in which you can do the transition arrangements. When we modelled it, excuse me, we assumed that when enough autonomous vehicles were on the road, you would reserve a lane of the freeway, for example, like you have a transit lane today, you would reserve it for autonomous vehicles, because they can effectively pack in twice as many vehicles per lane as you can ordinary vehicles, because they react at machine speed as opposed to human speed. But as you point out, it's also a viable strategy to have certain times of day or certain areas of the city. So if you think of London with their congestion tax, you could introduce a zone in cities that was autonomous vehicles only. So there are multiple of those transition strategies, and it makes a lot of sense to adopt those early, and that, in fact, will encourage the uptake as well.
Any more questions? Just give us a moment. I think we should have more questions. No? Mr. Bradlow, is there anything else that you would like to offer us? We're out of questions for the moment.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing comment I would add to it is that you've talked about transition arrangements. The impact of ICT on the society overall, as I said in the beginning, is going to be very significant, and no more so than in what work we do and the where we work and how we work. And I think that if we get ahead of the game and plan for a society in which these things happen, it'll serve us far better than if we assume that we can stop these transitions occurring. So my encouragement to government and to business and to the citizens of Australia is it takes a lot of adjustment in terms of human behaviour and outlook and the way we think about things, but the sooner we make that adjustment, the better off we're all going to be.
Yes, and I guess the other comment that has sparked my imagination is that when you look at autonomous vehicles, and in some ways the solar power and battery storage, we're plugging this into an ancient world, and as we move forward, we need to have parallel development of our housing and of our roads and of our traffic management systems to optimise the efficiency of this technology that's now available to us. And I guess that's the challenge.
Yeah. And look at traffic management. In a world of fully autonomous vehicles, you don't need traffic lights anymore. all intersections of free flowing, which is a tremendous saving in congestion. But from a point of view of someone walking across a road and cars flowing all around them, it takes a bit of adjustment. It's not going to happen overnight.
There's a problem with those pedestrians. Pesky little people who want to cross the road. Well, that is a significant issue, isn't it?
No, you can actually build pedestrians into the system because we're all carrying phones which will communicate with the vehicle. And the difficult part is getting people to accept it, to walk across the road and just assume they won't get run over and take an act of faith.
Sort of a natural justice if they walk across the road at the wrong time. Okay, well, I think, is that all we have? Okay, well, thank you for attending the public hearing today. The Secretariat will send you a draft transcript of proceedings, so requests can be made to correct any errors in transcription. It would be helpful if you could send the Secretariat any additional material that you have undertaken to provide. I don't think there is anything in that area. I ask a member now to move that the committee authorise publication, including publication of the parliamentary database of the proof of transcript of the evidence given before it at the public hearing today. Thank you. I declare the public hearing closed. And again, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.